One of the great things I found about the Australian Lure Fishing podcast is that I can go back and listen to previous episodes and learn things that I'd either forgotten or never picked up in the first listen to an episode. And this episode with Dan Selby, talking about fishing the Hawkesbury system for jewfish or mulloway, whichever you like to call them, is one of those episodes where I went back, had a listen, and picked up some things that are going to help me moving forward. And so it made sense to me to repost it so that my listeners could do the same thing. So folks, this is a repost of episode 88 way back. Nearly 600 episodes ago now, the Australian Lure Fishing podcast. But it's a golden episode that is loaded with tips and will definitely help improve your fishing, particularly if Hawkesbury River jewfish are your target. Now, another thing that can help you to improve your catch rate is becoming part of Team Doc Lure, supporting the Australian Lure Fishing podcast and getting that members-only content. So extended podcast interviews, live streams where we go through how to find fishing spots and tackle talks and all that kind of stuff. There's also ebooks, audio masterclasses, and tackle deals as well. In fact, if you're in the market for a rod, now's the perfect time to do that because I've got a new association with Jabbers Australia who bring what I reckon are the best travel rods in the country into Australia. And there's a couple of rods there that are absolutely perfect for Hawkesbury River jewfish fishing. And one in particular that I'm super keen on is the Urban Beats Def Flicker, which is just a brilliant little lightweight rod that can handle tons and tons and tons of pressure from strong fighting fish. So go and check that out, doclures.com Jabbers for that. Or if you want to become part of Team Doc Lures, it's team.doclures.com. Now, the other thing you can do, folks, and you can do this for free and it'll, again, help you improve your fishing, is jump over to doclures.com, type Selby, S-E-L-B-Y, into the search bar and get the show notes for this episode. And in those show notes, you'll find a link to a Hawkesbury River fishing map, as well as links to a page where I discuss fishing in the Hawkesbury system more generally. And so that'll help you also to find your way around the system and to catch more fish there. So lots of great resources there to help you catch more fish on the Hawkesbury system. And of course, great tackle deals as well. doclures.com/jabbers to go and check out those rods. Don't forget that. But now, folks, let's play episode 88 of the Australian Lure Fishing podcast and hit the Hawkesbury system with Dan Selby in chase of the mighty mulloway.
Well, there's been several of them. There was one recently this year. There was a 1.7 metre mulloway I had with a client who'd also, in the last two trips, got a 1.25 metre cobia and a 1.7 metre kingfish from the harbour. But his jewfish was the most memorable.
You're listening to Hawkesbury River fishing guide Dan Selby telling us all about how to target jewfish, mulloway if you like, on the Hawkesbury system. It's a great episode, tons of great information for all our New South Wales, Central Coast and Sydney Hawkesbury area listeners. So folks, let's kick off the intro music. I can't wait to get started.
This is the Australian Lure Fishing Podcast, where we share the secrets of Australia's lure fishing gurus every Monday, Wednesday and Friday. And now here's your host, Greg Vinal from doclures.com.
Folks, welcome to the Australian Lure Fishing Podcast. If you're a regular listener, welcome back. If you're a new listener, well, my name is Greg Vinal and my job is to find Australia's best lure anglers, bring them on the show and get them to share a few secrets that'll help guys like you and I catch fish on lures. Now, my guest today is Dan Selby. Dan has been fishing the Hawkesbury and he's been targeting dewies there for many years, almost a decade in fact. He's out there 7 days a week fishing with his clients and he knows both the system and the species really, really well, as you are about to find out. And Dan will give us a few of his secrets and help us to dispel a few myths about how to catch dewies in the Hawkesbury system. It was a great pleasure talking to Dan, so I hope you enjoy the episode as much as I enjoyed it, and I will see you at the other end. Dan, welcome to Australian Lure Fishing. Great to have you on the show.
G'day, Greg. Pleasure to be here, mate.
Now, my friend, you have a bit of a reputation for knowing how the jewfish work in the Hawkesbury system, and I'm really looking forward to extracting a few of your secrets tonight. So you ready for a big episode?
I sure am, Greg. Fire away.
That'll be fantastic. Look, before we start extracting your secrets, though, mate, we're going to spend a little bit of time just getting to know you so that our listeners know who's talking to them. And it's just nice to break the ice before we start talking hardcore fishing. So, mate, let's start out by talking about the species that you like to target on lures. So, obviously, the old dewies, that's one of them. What else do you like to chase with lures, mate?
Yeah, and I grew up targeting bass, so I really adore them, but I've got a soft spot for cod as well.
So no shortage of targets there, and all of them available in your part of the world, and naturally. So if you could take off for a week, go off fishing, just you and a fishing rod, no responsibilities, no clients, money's not an issue, whereabouts in Australia would you go and why?
Oh, there's so many great options, Greg. Top of my list, the Murray River for some of the huge wild river Murray cod they've got down there, casting lures at those. Top water or spinner baits, big hard bodies. And I'd love to do some GT popping on the Great Barrier Reef too. That'd be sensational. It's for the visual strikes and the sheer pulling force of those fish. And boat driving and all that sort of stuff comes into it. That'd really tick the box for me.
All right, mate. So you've caught lots of different species in your time. There's plenty of different species around Sydney Harbour and the Hawkesbury system. But what's a species that's on your bucket list that you haven't managed to tick off yet?
Well, not much locally, but my ultimate fish to catch would have to be a black bass in Papua New Guinea. Whether it's surface, subsurface, as long as it's casting to a snag and hooking one of those brutes, that's on my bucket list.
All right. What's something that we might find in your fishing kit that might come as a bit of a surprise to us?
Rice.
Rice. Okay. Let's hear the explanation for that one, mate. Do you get hungry on the boat?
Yeah, and it also makes a nice side dish to some of the fish we catch. But its main purpose is it's just dried rice, dried white rice, and I keep it in my tackle boxes, especially my jig head box, for keeping moisture and rust to an absolute minimum. It works very, very effectively. It's very, very cheap to do. But interesting thing, most times I open up my jig head box on board my charters and people remark, "Is that rice?"
Mate, that is an awesome way to start the episode. That's a fantastic tip. And look, you know, the perennial problem of rusting hooks in the lure box is something that a lot of people are looking for a solution for, and it doesn't come much simpler than loading up your tackle box with a bit of rice. So great start, mate. Really love that. All right, now let's talk about technology or fishing gadgets. Have you got any that you really would like to share with us?
The one thing I could never live without, being on a boat, a canoe, a kayak, punt, doesn't matter, is an electric motor, especially a bow mount electric motor. They really do revolutionise our lure fishing, hold you in the area, help you retrieve lures back. Yeah, and I had a good hard think about that one, and an electric motor definitely is up there, alongside a sounder.
Yeah, for most people it comes down to a choice between one or the other, and I guess it really depends on the style of fishing you do and where you fish and what species you target as to which might be the more important to you. But a lot of people reckon that the electric motor is more important because it's one thing to find the fish, it's another thing to actually be able to get a cast to them. So a sounder could be frustrating if you can find the fish but you can't hold station long enough to get a cast in. So good answer, mate. Let's talk about your fishing idols or people that you look up to. So mate, if you could spend a day fishing with anyone in the world, alive or someone who's passed on now, who would you take out on the boat with you?
It's actually my good mate Matt. I've fished a lot with the guy, travelled around a bit with him, and spent many a great times getting personal bests and just firsts and just exploring new places. It'd have to be my mate Matt.
Good stuff, and that's what fishing's all about. Catching fish is just one small part of it. So, mate, last question in this getting to know you session. Tell us about the best Jewy you've caught out of the Hawkesbury system, the one that is your most memorable catch, and it might not necessarily be your biggest one, but the one that really sticks in your memory as being a golden capture.
Well, there's been several of them. There was one recently this year. There was a 1.7 metre mulloway I had with a client who'd also, in the last two trips, got a 1.25 metre cobia and a 1.7 metre kingfish from the harbour. But his Jewfish was the most memorable. It was caught on a live bait, unfortunately, not a lure. But definitely the biggest Jewfish I've seen come out of here in the flesh. Yeah, that's my most memorable. There's been plenty of others that were my most memorable, but until that fish came along. Trump the rest.
Mate, you have whet our appetites with that one. No doubt about that. 1.7 metres. What a fish. Fantastic stuff. And some other classic catches there as well. Big do. So mate, Jewfish, they are a fantastic sports fish. And until, maybe a decade or two ago, weren't all that commonly caught on lures. But these days, very, very regularly caught on lures, but not an easy capture. So tell us what it is about targeting Jewies that makes you want to go out there and chase them.
Well, Greg, they're certainly a challenging fish, and they challenge the angler to think outside the square and to really consider the environment which they are residing. It works as a whole system. And so to understand the fish, you kind of have to understand the whole system. And there's no real shortcuts to them. It's a progressive thing that an angler will do throughout his career. Doesn't come easily, you always got to work towards it. There's always something to work towards with mulloway. There's always a bigger one or a different way to catch them, different scenario, and they're always challenging you to think.
That's true, and I think, if you look at lots of other estuarine species, that, they tend to be pretty predictable, and once you've been fishing for them a few years, quite often you'll get them figured out, and that's it, and you can just keep going out there and you can get better and better at catching them. But Jewies, they're a bit of a challenge. That makes it interesting, doesn't it?
Oh, very interesting. No 2 days are the same out here, and when you think you're not going to catch them, you'll have the best day you've ever had.
Which is a great reason to always go out and give it a go, and we talk about this quite often. We'll talk later on in the episode about, what are the kind of the bite windows, the times of the day and times of the month and times of the tide when you're most likely to catch a Dewey. But like you say, you can go out there and be surprised so often, so don't wait for those perfect conditions. Just get out there and give it a go, and you'll never know what might turn up. So mate, you've fished the Hawkesbury system for a long time, and you're a guide. You fish it consistently. You're on the water day in, day out. You're helping other people catch Jewfish, so you really know the species well. So tell us something that you've learned in all those years of experience that perhaps 90% of people wouldn't know about catching Jewfish on lures.
One of the biggest ones is they can be caught on relatively light line. We're talking school-sized fish up to and over that metre mark. They're the bulk of size of them, but they can be caught on really light line, 4 pound, 6 pound braid, 8, 10 pound leaders. And this benefits the fish as well with not giving them barotrauma because they have a bit more of a pronounced fight on that lighter tackle. They're not being dragged up from deeper depths really quickly, which makes it good for their catch and release.
And the great thing about Deweys is that, they fight hard, but they tend to fight fairly clean, don't they? They'll have a couple of big runs, really give you a bit of excitement, but they don't generally dive into the reef and brick you.
That's correct. Yeah, it's only very rarely. It's more of an inadvertent bust off, if anything, where they're just swimming past structure and we've got a long line angle out during the fight and they potentially clip something. But as you said, they don't typically dive for cover that we see. 95% of them will swim out from cover, even on relatively light line.
Yeah, great stuff. So what do you reckon's a mistake that a lot of people make when they're targeting Deweys on lures?
Probably fish too heavy. They're always aiming at the biggest fish, which most likely size that you're going to encounter is between 60 and a metre in our stock in New South Wales at the moment. Metre-long fish is roughly 20 pounds, and you can fish a lot lighter than that. You can fish 10 pounds for that fish, 10 pounds of line in braid and leader strength, and pull fish bigger than that, bigger and beyond that. We commonly get fish up to that metre 20 size on that tackle, but we rarely ever get busted off. But heavier lines, like I'll discuss later when we talk about some tackle, on 15, 20 pound outfits, a fight on one of those school sized fish is pretty quick, like under a minute. You can put a lot of hurt on them, and definitely people fish too heavy. And I'd say, clients bring their outfits along and things like that. And it's usually too heavy a line, which reduces your casting distance, reduces the sink rates on lures, the windage if it's a windy day, and just generally because of the thicker line reduces the amount of bites.
Yeah, so as you say, we'll get right into the tackle a bit later on, but that's a great tip and a very well made point there that, they're a fish that fights clean. They're a fish that can be played on light gear, and you can work your lures much better on light gear, and you can cast further and you can get your lures deeper and all that kind of good stuff. So, yeah, good stuff there, mate. Yeah, really, really good point.
Despite them having teeth, most lure hookups are in the mouth because the angler's striking at fish immediately, which protects our light line. It's how we're able to capture tailor and things like that as well. And bigger flathead is generally because when you're lure fishing, you get a hook up around the lips and the mouth, which why it's great for catch and release. But it's also allows you to fish light line without being bitten off.
Absolutely. And so, it's a different story if you're fishing big baits and you're waiting for the fish to get that bait down a bit deeper before you set the hook. Then the line really can come into contact with those raspy teeth of the Jewfish and it can get worn through. But we don't have that issue with lures. So look, every now and then when you're out on the water, and this doesn't happen a lot with Jewfish admittedly, but you have one of those purple patches. You'll have one of those days where it just really doesn't matter what you do, you're going to catch a fish every second cast. But every now and then we have the opposite of that as well. And we have those days where it looks like we're going to go home with a donut. So, mate, give us a few pointers for things that we can do if it looks like we're about to have a donut day.
Fish lighter line, number one, and make sure it's fluorocarbon on your leader material. Down to 6 and 8 pound leaders still achievable because quite frankly, you've got to hook a fish before you even know if you're going to land it or not. And you can definitely put a lot of hurt on a fish on those lighter lines. And scent is another big one. Addition of scent.
What scent do you use, mate?
I use a lot of S-Factor, Procures.
Okay, cool. All right, mate, look, some great stuff there to get us started. Let's imagine now that I've turned up to have a fish in the Hawkesbury, and I have fished the system a couple of times, not particularly hard and not for Jewfish, but imagine I've just turned up there, I've got the boat in tow, I'm looking for an opportunity to tangle with a Jewfish. What advice would you give me as to where I should start looking for fish? What are the structures that they're sitting in? Where should I launch my boat? How big's the Hawkesbury system? Give us a few sort of basic details about how we might get started looking for a fish.
Wow, how big's the system? It's massive. Hundreds of kilometres of tidal, navigable water where these mulloway Jewfish will reside. Your key points in this river is it's quite large and quite featureless throughout large sections, like most systems are. And there's key little areas, deeper outer bends, which generally incorporate rock walls, natural rock walls. There's huge towering sandstone escarpments, which have given way to boulders over the years with rock slides. A lot of those have ended up in the water. So they're areas we specifically target. Obviously, those big boulders and things create eddies, back eddies, even ones that you can't see. And then your other structures, we've got a couple of main bridges. They fish well for mulloway as well, although have a great deal of tidal strength there. So obviously your tide changes are probably key there. And then, so you're looking for any reefs. There's a few good reefs in here that are well known. You've got back eddies, there's islands, drop-offs, holes, and then you can get up your creeks where you're typically getting more into holes and deeper outer bends. It's very similar to most other systems in that regard of fish holding structure. There's not a great deal of wrecks in here from over the years, but it's lots of natural structure. As I said, only two bridges, which are sort of right next to each other, the road and rail bridges. They're well known. Same with your Juno points and Flint and Steels, very well known areas. And they're just more major points as you come into the system. Flint and Steel has a reef on it, protrudes into the current. Yeah, it's all natural structure is what I like to target in this river. And that's what I'd search for if I hit any system, and especially this Hawkesbury, is some kind of structure.
All right, mate. So that's really great general information. It tells us kind of the structures that we're looking for, but let's narrow down some of the other factors that might influence where the fish might be sitting and see if we can get to a point where we can improve our chances of finding them just a little bit more. So tell us about the time of year and the type of tides that you prefer for targeting dewies.
All right. The tides one is a huge contentious issue amongst everyone. Everyone's got their favourite tides and things. Me personally, I just fish what's in front of me and what's given to me. So tide changes are the key part. So whether it's a big tide or a small tide, so your spring tides or your neap tides, doesn't really matter. On the neaps, you're going to get longer periods to fish because your tide changes will last a bit longer. On the king tides, your tide changes are very small. On those bigger tides, you need to be very efficient with your angling, and especially if you want to hit multiple spots throughout a tide on one tide change, you'll have to be quite efficient at moving and only fishing small time frames in each area. And you've got to be very, very efficient to stay on the tide. Whereas the smaller tides will give you longer windows, but there might still only be small bite windows where the fish want to feed too. When the current gets enough or eases off a bit, or
Yep.
There's no rhyme or reason with it. You just fish those tide change periods on any given tide that you have, and you'll tend to pull a bit better success.
So the other part of the question was time of year. So are there better months for the dewies in the Hawkesbury, or is it a year-round system?
So you can catch them year round here, most definitely. My preference, though, is autumn, winter and spring. In the height of summer, the boat traffic, skiers, wakeboarders, jet skiers, and generalised, other recreational anglers and boaters can get a bit overwhelming when you're trying to find a nice, quiet place to target the elusive mulloway, which is typically the scenario you're looking for, a little bit of quieter water. So I tend to target kingfish throughout summer, and then, mulloway are the mainstay. Tend to catch bigger ones right in the depths of winter. Seems to be a common trend, but there's still plenty of good fish to be had in spring and autumn, that's for sure.
What about lunar cycles, mate? Do you pay much attention to those, or do you just fish what's in front of you?
The only sort of thing I'd pay attention to with the lunar cycle is when that new moon comes around. School mulloway do have a very big preference for eating prawns, and the Hawkesbury's famous for producing school prawns for bait and for food. And so around that new moon cycle, it would pay to have a prawn imitation in your quiver to throw at any point during the day, just because those fish would be focused on eating prawns. And the common searches in their stomach contents, once we've retained a fish, reveal it's very common. You can get multiple different things in there, little small fish, leather jackets, white bait, a mantis shrimp. There's usually always some part of a prawn in there.
What about time of day? Do you fish for them right through the day? I know a lot of people tend to think that dewies are only available at night or at the sort of the dawn and dusk periods, but do you fish for them right through the day?
Yes, so all my fishing charters are held through the day. I, like a few other mulloway anglers, will suggest that the middle of the day seems to be quite productive, especially in this system. I'm not sure, because of the murkier water at times, that gives the best visibility for those fish to hunt, or the fact that we finally find them by midday, which is usually a second tide change from the first one that would have been at dawn, and 6 hours before, 6 a.m.-ish. We might miss an opportunity there, which creates a bit of desperation to make it happen at midday. I'm not sure, but they're definitely a viable target all day long, and there's no we have to be there for the dawn session type of mentality that's ever been instilled in me. It can happen at any point during the day.
Yeah, great stuff. And that is music to our ears. And folks, this is why I love talking to fishing guides, because guys like Dan, their livelihood depends on them being able to catch fish, not only being able to catch fish, but to help their clients catch fish. And they can't be picky about tides and weather conditions and that kind of stuff. They've got to be able to catch fish under any conditions. So it's great talking to blokes like Dan who have got lots of different tips, but they can put at rest those theories we might have about tide and moon and all sorts of other things that might be influencing the fish, and say to us, just go out there, have a go, and do these things, and that's going to potentially put you onto a fish. So, Dan, some great stuff there. Now, what I'd like to do now is move on and talk a little bit about tackle. And you've told me already that when people turn up on your boat to fish for dewies, quite often they've brought gear that's just too heavy. So let's break down the perfect dewey outfit for the Hawkesbury system.
All right. So what I use and recommend just about every day as my go-to outfit is a 3 to 6 kilo one piece, my own preference, 7-foot rod, matched to a 2500 size reel with about 200 metres of 8 to 10 pound braid. Is my absolute go-to outfit. We can subdue fish to 1.30 metre on that. I'm not sure we've had the opportunity to do anything bigger on that at this point in time, but that's the perfect outfit for throwing 3, 4, 5-inch lures, possibly 6-inch lures if they're not too bulky. And then my second outfit is for throwing larger soft plastics from your 6 inches up to 7, 8 inches long, is 6 to 8 kilo rod, a 4,000 size reel with 15 to 20 pound braid. And I usually always go on the lighter side of what I'm suggesting there in braid, because it does tend to break a little bit heavier than what they state on the box. It gives us that thinness in the line for what I mentioned earlier about longer casts, cutting through the wind if there is any wind, and then cutting through the water, which allows us to fish lighter jig heads and more natural presentations to the fish.
Yeah, and also to fish more effectively when there's a bit of current flowing as well. If you've got a thick, heavy line, it tends to get moved around more by the current. So really important to use those lighter lines to increase your window of opportunity there to cast lures around. So great stuff, mate. Could you talk to us a little bit about leaders? You've already mentioned that you use quite often a 10-pound leader. Are you a fan of fluorocarbon, or do you use mono? What's the sort of the deal with your leaders?
Yeah, so I'm 100% fluorocarbon with everything I've got from 6 pound to 80 pound, pretty much. I don't know, I just developed a bad habit with that over the years. I still have some supple, normal trace material for really heavy stuff, but I love fluorocarbon. It's got minimal sort of stretch in it. It's got that near invisibleness to the fish, that low refractive index, I think is the terminology. Yeah, and 10 pound is plenty strong enough. It's usually as strong as your weakest knot, I think they say. So practice your knots. That's the weak point. The line in a straight line pull is phenomenal. Like, we lift abandoned crab pots and sticks and all sorts of things up off the bottom. And it's all down to tying good knots and adjusting your drag to suit. Use angling technique to beat a fish.
Absolutely. So tell us what knots you prefer for attaching your leader to your line and for attaching your lure to your leader.
Yep. So leader to braid to main line is a FG knot, 30-turn FG knot. That's all the way through from my small stuff, 3 pound to 6 pound, and 8 to 10 pound or 10 pound to 10 pound, but all the way through to heavy stuff. That is my go-to knot these days. We've evolved through all of the knots over the years. A fallback straight back to an Albright knot, in a situation where you really just need to get a leader back on quickly. But the FG knot has done so many things for us, from allowing us to use these rods with the really fine guides to running super long leaders and being able to wind them onto a reel. Just so many things. The getting your lures back factor is huge, or if you have to break a lure off, we're not actually breaking leaders off anymore. And that's down to the knot I tie to my terminal, my jig head or my vibe or whatever, is a locked full blood knot, which has got super integrity, but it will break before my FG knot. The best case scenario is to just tie another lure on, especially on a tide change period or something like that. Back in the day, we were bimini twists into either Slim Beauties or for Albrights and improved Albrights, and that knot was still weak. And a lot of the times if we were busting off, we'd actually pop a leader and a lure off and have to sit down and do a bimini, a leader, choose a lure, all that. And it was very time consuming and unproductive.
Yeah.
So the FG knots certainly improved our fishing and productiveness.
And look, I don't ask that question of every one of my guests, but I'd have to say that the majority of people who I've asked what knot do they use to attach their leader to their line, the majority of people have said the FG knot. So folks, if you don't know how to tie an FG knot, it's not that difficult. It takes a little bit of practice, but it's not that hard. But jump onto YouTube. There's a ton of great videos there. You can find out, get some tutorials there, find out how to tie an FG knot, and it will be very much worth your while to learn that knot before you get out on the water. So great stuff, Dan. Now, look, what I would like to do now is put you under a bit of pressure, mate, because the next part of this interview is all about the lures, but we're going to narrow it down to just 3 top lures, and that's always a bit of a challenge. We all like to have lots of lures in our box, but what I'd like you to do is just give us the 3 that if you could fish with nothing else, they're the ones you'd choose. So
I thought long and hard about it, and I've come up with a short list.
Excellent.
My first one is a Pro Lure 130 fishtail in any of their colours. Just the size, profile, and the action of the lure is hands down one of the best paddle tails on the market for targeting mulloway and large flathead for that matter. The colour range is all UV enhanced. What more can you say?
Great. Can you tell us what size jig head I mean, I know it varies depending on the currents and the wind and all that kind of stuff, but tell us what size of jig head you would generally start with, and then you'd obviously work up or down from there depending on how the lure's performing.
Yeah. So jig head selection with any paddle tail varies on the shape of the tail and the flexibility of the rubber. And so generally you're always trying to fish the lightest jig head you can possibly get away with. But with a paddle tail scenario, you're typically picking something that's going to pull the tail more so than anything else. We've got to get the action out of the lure. Some lures will come a little bit bent in a packet, or the tail might be a little bit deformed to the side, so you might save that one to run on a heavier jig head. So I'm usually 3/8 or 10 grams as a go-to for most paddle tails, and then obviously you can go up to 1/2 ounce, 5/8 and a 3/4 on some of the bigger lures just to pull that tail and get it kicking. Sometimes sink rate doesn't matter in that scenario. You get plenty of action and body rock and roll out of the lure. It's just to get that lure going. Whereas if you're fishing a minnow style lure or a stick bait, there's plenty of different definitions for them. So a lure with no inherent action, a straight stick bait, you can get away with running quite light jig heads in those because they don't draw any water as they sink. They don't displace water very much, and they'll fall through and glide down very naturally. So you're looking at 1/6 to 1/4, and then up to a 10 gram or a 3/8 jig head for those deeper applications.
Yeah, great stuff. Some awesome advice here. So, mate, tell us how you go about fishing those pro lures.
Well, typically you just sink them to the bottom, where then you either do a single hop, you can do a single big hop, a small little flick of the rod. You can do multiple different things to draw different actions out of the lure. But your typical one is a double hop and then letting the lure sink back to the bottom again. Other good ones when you feel the fish are a bit active or the bait's sitting high that you may have noticed is you can sink it to the bottom and then just slow roll back, slow wind back on the reel and intermittently pausing it to let it achieve depth again. You can recontact the bottom and then just slow rolling it back and maybe a few hops back towards the boat as the line angle's changing just to maintain that depth and stay in the zone. But definitely contact down near the bottom around structures is paramount.
Yeah, good stuff. And so when you're pausing or when you're letting that lure drop, are you letting it drop on a slack line or are you keeping that line semi-taut?
Semi-taut. It's not dead slack, but it's not tight. You can have it drop tight in certain scenarios, but for the most part, you want controllable amounts of slack in your line so that you're able to strike at the fish. Sometimes if you fish too tight, there's a lot of missed bumps and bites because they do implode on the lure. So having that little bit of slack in the line allows the fish to actually draw the lure in, which will give the angler more solid hook sets when a bite is detected and they swing it.
Yeah, so for those that are not familiar, when you say they implode on the lure, it's a bit like the barra. They've got a big bucket mouth, so they're close to the lure. When they open that mouth fast, it's like a big vacuum cleaner, sucks everything in. And if your line's taut, then that lure may not get sucked in deep. Whereas if there's just a little bit of slack in the line there, it's going to get deeper into the mouth with a better chance of the hook finding its home and nailing the fish for you. So some great tips there, mate. Fantastic stuff. So let's move on to your second lure choice.
My second lure is totally opposite to the first one in that it's a stick bait or a minnow, so a 5-inch centered jerk shad. Quite sure what they're called, from Z-Man. They've got a multitude of different colours to choose from, and so they're pre-centered, 5 inches long. They still pull big brim and flathead for us as well, and they catch Jewies of all sizes. It's something different to show the fish, especially if they've seen a bit of pressure, over a weekend or, through a busy period, long weekends, things like that. It's just something different in your arsenal. It can also help you fish through, get your lure down on faster tides or faster currents and cut through the air, longer casts. Just a different action too when you're jerking the lure. So you typically fish that style of lure with more twitches in slackish sort of line to help that lure dart and glide. Very similar to what you'd do with a topwater walk the dog bait or surface stick bait, where you're jerking it and then leaving a little bit of slack to allow the lure to glide naturally on those flatter faces that have been designed onto the lure.
Great stuff, mate. You've explained that absolutely brilliantly. So we've got 2 lures down. What's your third choice, mate?
My third choice would be, and it's only just been out recently, is the Squidgy Bio Tough. It's in the 100mm fish. It's a super durable lure. Great colour range again, UV enhanced. It's just been a good fish puller. It seems to just draw the bites out from other fish. It's got a unique paddle tail, which is somewhere in between the other two. The Pro Lure's got that bigger, flatter tail. The stick bait obviously has just a little fork tail. And this thing's got like more of an oval-shaped, flatter tail, so different action again. It's something different, and the fish seem to like it. I'm fishing that very similar to the first lure, where you're sinking it to the bottom, generally a double hop or a single hop to get that tail moving on the way up and on the way down is the preferred method. You can slow roll it as well, but typically I'm doing a single or a double flick and then returning the lure down to the bottom on that semi-slack line, waiting for the bites on the drop.
Dan, you've absolutely crushed it. You've given us 3 top lures. Not only have you given us 3 top lures, but you've explained exactly how to use each of them. So that's fantastic. But we're going to ask you one last question, mate, because we can never get enough information out of a bloke like you. So by the time we finish this episode, there's going to be a whole bunch of guys that are going to be standing out on the Hawkesbury with a lure box. It's got the Pro Lure in it, the stick bait in it, and it's got the Squidgy fish in it. And they're going to be saying, now, which one am I going to tie on first? So, mate, tell us when you would fish each of those different styles. What's your thought process in deciding which one is most likely to be the best one to start with?
Any of them.
That's a perfectly valid answer. I mean, it may just be that you tie on the first one that comes to hand and cycle through them, but sometimes there might be some factors that might influence which one you want to use. And you have mentioned already that, the paddle tails tend to work better when there's not quite as much current, and you can work them a little bit more slowly. There's not as much belly in the line, that kind of stuff. The stick baits tend to work a little bit better when there's less current, so you can really impart some action to them. Sorry, when there's more current, you can really impart some action to them. Yeah, so that's kind of a good starting point. Is there anything else that you can add to that?
Yeah, so I'd be picking the Pro Lure. If you were after a trophy fish, that bigger fish, you don't want bycatch other than the odd big flathead. That's the lure you'd be tying on to target a big Hawkesbury mulloway. The others I run to catch bycatch with my fish because it makes the day more enjoyable. You may only be fishing for one mulloway bite a day. They'll certainly pick you up more bycatch, brim and flathead, estuary perch on those 2 smaller lures, the 5-inch and the 4-inch lure there mentioned. But for that big trophy fish, always throw a big one first light, early morning tide change, just to see if you can't tempt that bigger bite.
Yeah, great stuff. Now, folks, there is one more thing I'd like to add to this episode, and that is, if you really want to get hold of a Hawkesbury Dewey, you haven't fished there before, and, you've got a ton of great information now, but there's one more thing that you can do, and that's go out for a trip with Dan, because he operates an amazing charter service with a really, really good reputation for putting his clients onto some serious Jewfish. So, mate, tell us a little bit about your guiding business and what you've got on offer.
So I've been operating for 9 years now, Sydney Harbour and the Hawkesbury River. We do a lot of soft plastic lure fishing. I also do hard bodies and for brim and flathead, sometimes hard bodies for mulloway for troll. We target all array of species. So everything from your brim, flathead, mulloway, estuary perch, kingfish, tailor bonito, the odd cobia when it comes in, the odd estuary cod when it turns up to, blackfish, everything. Yeah, we're based out of Spencer, lovely Spencer on the Hawkesbury River. And we aim to put clients onto trophy fish on light tackle in calm, sheltered waters.
Excellent stuff, mate. And look, I've said this before and I'll say it again. You can spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to catch fish. If you're looking at a particular species or a particular system, it can take years to figure it out. And you can read books, magazines, you can listen to podcasts, you can watch YouTube as much as you like, but nothing beats getting out there with somebody that knows the system and knows the fish. So it's worth investing a small amount of money to go out with a bloke like Dan for a half day. By the time you've done that, you've gained a whole ton of experience in a very, very short amount of time, and you're a much better place to go out from there on your own, and you've got a much better chance of catching fish. So Dan, fantastic stuff, mate. Did you have any sponsors that you wanted to mention?
Yeah, I've got a few companies that support us. That's Pro Lure, Shimano, Lowrance, just a few of the major players that keep us ticking along and help us have quality gear and electronics.
And of course, folks, those are the companies that enable Dan to come on a show like this and share what he knows. So go and do yourselves a favour, have a look at the gear that Dan uses and support those companies because they support Dan, and Dan comes on the show and gives us all his good information. So, mate, great stuff. Now, one last thing, folks at home, of course, there will be some show notes for this episode. So if you zap over to doclures.com and type Selby, Selby, into the search bar, that's going to bring up the show notes for this episode where all the lures that Dan's referred to will be linked, where there will be a PDF you can download, an MP3 you can download, and of course, most importantly, all of Dan's contact details will be there as well. His social media, his phone number, his email, and whatever other details he would like to give us, we're happy to put them on the page. So Dan, you've absolutely crushed it. You've given us a ton of great information about tides and conditions to fish in, time of day, all the lures, all the tackle we need to hit the Hawkesbury system, and you've done it in style. So for that, we thank you, and mate, we'll see you out on the water sometime.
Thank you very much, Greg.
Don't miss a single episode of ALF. Subscribe and rate us on iTunes or jump on the doclures.com website for downloads and show notes. Till their next episode, Tidelines.